You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Great days start with great underwear. So if you're looking for something special, give Tommy John and gift a better day. Everything we make is meticulously crafted from breathable stretch fabric for the perfect fit, including our sleepwear for him and her. It feels good to give, but it feels great to give Tommy John. Find something for everyone and pick up something for yourself. Because at Tommy John, greatness is in our very fabric. Shop TommyJohn.com/Spotify right now and save 30% site-wide. TommyJohn.com/Spotify. See site for details.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 476 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
With this episode, we're going to be wrapping up our Red River Campaign story arc. As you guys will recall, by the end of the last show, Nathaniel Banks had managed to escape the trap that Confederate Commander Dick Taylor had tried to set for him at Monet's Ferry. 2 days later, on April 25th, 1864, the lead elements of Banks' column marched into Alexandria, Louisiana, returning to the town they had left 30 days before with such high hopes, heading for Shreveport.
But Banks' hopes of reaching Shreveport had been dashed at the Battle of Mansfield on April 8th and the Battle of Pleasant Hill the next day, April 9th. After those setbacks, the Federals' retreat had brought them all the way back to Alexandria.
Nathaniel Banks arrived back in Alexandria only vaguely aware of the trouble awaiting him. His Red River campaign had begun 5 weeks earlier, and in that short span of time, Ulysses S. Grant had become General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck was now the Army Chief of Staff, and William Tecumseh Sherman was making final preparations for his thrust down into Georgia aimed at capturing Atlanta.
During the course of the campaign, Banks sent carefully worded reports to Grant and to Washington, in which he painted the course of events in the best light possible, downplaying setbacks, continuing to insist he held the upper hand, and persisting in the narrative that he would reach Shreveport and capture that place.
However, while doing his best to put lipstick on a pig, Banks was unaware that messages were being sent back and forth among the people he was trying to hoodwink. Nor was he aware of newspaper reports and letters from officers and men within his command that condemned his decisions and painted his leadership of the campaign in the worst possible light.
Grant's March 31st orders to Banks had been plainly stated. Besides reiterating that A.J. Smith and his troops were to be returned to Sherman by April 15th, Grant told Banks that if he captured Shreveport, he was not to advance beyond that town, but instead was to consolidate his position and prepare to play a major role in Grant's plan to launch a strike against Mobile, Alabama, the important Confederate blockade-running port on the Gulf Coast.
Banks received those orders on April 18th while he was at Grand Ecore. At about the same time, Grant received a message from Banks dated April 2nd, in which Banks told Grant of his intention to chase the Confederates out of Louisiana and into Texas. Well, that letter infuriated Grant. If Banks carried out such a move, it would upset Grant's timetable regarding Mobile. Grant had planned for a movement that would threaten Mobile by May 1st. Mounting a threat to Mobile was critical to Grant's larger plans, since it would tie down Confederate forces under Leonidas Polk in Mississippi and Alabama and prevent Polk from going to Georgia to help the rebels there against Sherman.
On April 17th, Grant sent Major General David Hunter to find Banks and make it very plain to Banks that Mobile was more important to Grant's plans than Shreveport. Grant told Hunter that if he found Banks had managed to take Shreveport and started to advance into East Texas, he was to tell him to retrace his steps, consolidate his position, and prepare for the operation against Mobile.
Hunter arrived in Alexandria on April 27th, 2 days after Banks' column had returned to the town. Meanwhile, on April 18th, there were messages between Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Cairo, Illinois. David Dixon Porter's headquarters were located at Cairo, and Stanton received word that dispatches from Porter told of Banks' defeat at Mansfield and his retreat to Pleasant Hill. At that point, no mention was made of Banks' withdrawal to Grand Ecore.
Stanton also saw the first newspaper reports of the battles at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill and forwarded them to Grant, along with the naval dispatches from Cairo. Shortly after that, Stanton received word from Sherman that he'd received news from A.J. Smith that Banks' Red River campaign had turned into a disaster.
Stanton forwarded that report to Grant as well. A hopping mad Grant telegraphed Halleck that he wanted Banks removed from command and replaced with Major General J.J. Reynolds, who was then at New Orleans. Halleck took Grant's wire to Abraham Lincoln, who told him to hold off on Banks' removal. That's because Lincoln had one eye on the upcoming presidential election that fall, and he knew that sacking Banks would cost him, that is, Lincoln, support in New England.
On April 25th, Grant sent Banks word that he was countermanding the order to return A.J. Smith's troops to Sherman as soon as possible. Grant did so after Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles informed him that David Dixon Porter had said Smith's troops were still needed to help protect his ships.
And so Grant finally, reluctantly, abandoned his plans regarding Mobile, since he realized one of the consequences of Banks' Red River fiasco was that no troops from west of the Mississippi would be available to take part in an operation against the blockade-running port. Grant's simmering anger at Banks manifested itself in a new suggestion that Halleck go down and take command of the Department of the Gulf himself.
Halleck had no desire to leave Washington to go back into the field, so a workaround was devised, whereby Major General Edward R.S. Canby was given command of the newly reorganized military division of West Mississippi, comprising the departments of the Gulf and Arkansas. Banks would remain in command of the Department of the Gulf, but would be subordinate to Canby.
It was made clear to Canby that this arrangement was a politically expedient way to take away Banks' authority over the Department of the Gulf. Henceforth, Banks would be nothing more than a figurehead, relegated to the sidelines, while Canby would be the one in charge.
Nathaniel Banks knew nothing of the messages about him flying back and forth behind the scenes. During that time, he was at Alexandria with Dick Taylor's Confederates to worry about, and with David Dixon Porter's ships trapped above the town by the alarmingly low water in the Red River.
Porter was facing a potential disaster at Alexandria. As we've said, the Confederates and their successful efforts upriver to lower the water level in the Red were the reason many of Porter's most powerful vessels were trapped above the town, unable to navigate the rocky channel known as the Chute. Those timberclads, tinclads, monitors, and city-class ironclads all were stuck above Alexandria. Lexington, Osage, Neosho, Mound City, Louisville, Pittsburgh, Carondelet, Chillicothe, Ozark, and Fort Hindman. They would have to be destroyed to keep them out of enemy hands if Confederate pressure forced Banks to abandon Alexandria. It was Porter's report to Gideon Welles, laying out his dilemma, that led to Ulysses S. Grant's decision to allow A.J. Smith's troops to remain at Alexandria, helping defend the town, rather than having them returned to William Tecumseh Sherman.
The number of options open to the Federals was limited as far as saving Porter's vessels. A large number of troops would be required to garrison Alexandria, waiting for the autumn rains to raise the level of the Red. But everyone agreed that tying down that many men at Alexandria for that long in the middle of Confederate territory would be unwise.
The only other possibility was forcing the water level at Alexandria to rise so that the trapped vessels could get down through the chute. Well, an engineer officer from Wisconsin, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bailey, had an idea about how that might be done. You see, before the war, Bailey had worked in the logging industry in Wisconsin and was familiar with the practice of building temporary dams to increase the water level so that logs might be floated downstream to sawmills.
Bailey suggested to William Buell Franklin that temporary dams might be used to raise the level of the Red at Alexandria so that the trapped Navy vessels could get through the chute. Franklin was favorably impressed by the idea and sent Bailey with a letter of introduction to David Dixon Porter.
Porter, though, wasn't interested in listening to an Army officer's plan to save his naval vessels. However, William Buell Franklin, himself an engineer, was convinced Bailey's idea had merit, so Franklin arranged for Bailey to meet with Nathaniel Banks and David Hunter on April 29th.
Bailey's idea appealed to Banks, especially with Hunter there acting as Ulysses S. Grant's eyes and ears at Alexandria. With Hunter having communicated Grant's displeasure over Banks' handling of the campaign thus far, Nathaniel Banks was anxious to wrap things up at Alexandria and get back to New Orleans.
But Banks couldn't afford to abandon Porter, not with Hunter there watching him. So he gave Franklin the green light to try Bailey's plan. If the plan was successful and Porter's trapped vessels were freed, it would mean Banks could leave Alexandria without fear of censure by Grant.
Unfortunately, the very same day that construction began, Franklin left Alexandria on a leave of absence due to the broken leg he had suffered at Mansfield when his horse fell on him in the midst of the panicked Federal troops fleeing the battlefield.
Franklin's departure made Bailey's task much more difficult. While a general officer's word could get things done, men were less inclined to listen to a mere lieutenant colonel. In particular, Bailey had trouble securing soldiers to work on the dams, since some regimental commanders thought the project was a total waste of time.
In the end, most of the construction was done by soldiers from Maine who had been lumbermen before the war, and by black troops from the Corps d'Afrique.
From the west bank of the Red, trees felled by the Maine men formed a dam extending out toward the middle of the river. On the east bank, buildings were torn down, and bricks, stones, parts of walls and roofs, and other materials were piled into barges to make cribs that were sunk in the river, extending out toward the middle of the Red.
By May 8th, after a week of work, the tree dam and the crib dam were complete, and the water level through the chute had risen significantly.
The latest draft vessels, Neosho, Osage, and Fort Hindman, moved to the area just upstream of the dam, where a pool of deeper water had formed. The ironclads didn't do so, since they were still loaded with cotton, and while removing the cotton would have lightened them sufficiently to pass down the chute, Porter wasn't willing to lose the white gold.
As the water level rose behind the dams, it exerted increasing pressure on them until at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 9th, they started to break apart. Porter quickly ordered Lexington through the gap in the center, and she managed to get down through the chute even as the water level fell. Osage, Neosho, and Fort Heiman followed.
Since the other vessels hadn't been moved down to the pool behind the dams before the water level started to fall, they were still trapped upstream. Bailey immediately began repairing the dams and decided that other structures, called wing dams, needed to be built behind the main dam to direct the flow of water into the center of the channel.
By this time, Banks was getting antsy, wanting to start evacuating Alexandria and getting away from the place. Porter was certain that if Hunter hadn't been there, Nathaniel Banks would have bolted already, but A.J. Smith assured the admiral that even if Banks marched off now, he and his men would remain at Alexandria as long as Porter needed them.
While Porter waited for Bailey's efforts to once again raise the water level through the chute, he ordered work to begin removing guns and armor plating, as well as the precious cotton bales, from the ironclads, so that they could be transported by wagon below the chute.
By May 11th, the wing dams were complete, but the water level through the chute still hadn't risen sufficiently, so Bailey went back to work, and 2 days later, the water was high enough for the lightened ironclads to shoot through the gap and down the chute to safety.
By May 15th, David Dixon Porter had steamed down the Red, and his little fleet was once more out in the wide waters of the Mississippi River. He wrote to his mother, telling her, "I am clear of my troubles, and my fleet is safe out in the broad Mississippi. I have had a hard and anxious time of it."
Great days start with great underwear. So if you're looking for something special, give Tommy John and gift a better day. Everything we make is meticulously crafted from breathable stretch fabric for the perfect fit, including our sleepwear for him and her. It feels good to give, but it feels great to give Tommy John. Find something for everyone and pick up something for yourself, because at Tommy John, greatness is in our very fabric. Shop TommyJohn.com/Spotify right now and save 30% site-wide. TommyJohn.com/Spotify. See site for details.
From your fryer to the table, it's a quick trip for crispy fries. But how about a crosstown delivery? McCain SureCrisp fries are designed to go from fryer to container to carrier to passenger seat across town during rush hour, down a shortcut that wasn't all that short to a doorstep before they hit the table. And that first bite, the crispiness speaks for itself. To the last bite, McCain SureCrisp fries. Go the distance. See how far our fries can take your business at surecrisp.com/delivery.
At 7 o'clock on the morning of May 13th, the same day Porter's ironclads escaped downriver, the first of Banks' army troops marched out of Alexandria. A little over an hour later, with most of the troops still in town, buildings began to burn.
Union soldiers torched buildings indiscriminately, even burning the homes of staunch Unionists, including people whose sons had enlisted in the Union Army during the Federals' occupation of the town. Several members of Banks' staff and the Provost Guard tried to stop the arson, but within 3 hours, most of Alexandria was in flames.
As the Federals marched away from Alexandria, Dick Taylor harassed the column with what forces he had at hand, forcing a sharp skirmish and a 4-hour artillery duel about 40 miles down the road on the morning of May 16th. But he was unable to keep the Yankees from continuing their march.
Another sharp engagement took place 2 days later, on the 18th, at Yellow Bayou, but Taylor simply didn't have enough men to stop Banks. On May 19th and 20th, the Federals crossed the Atchafalaya River at Simmsport on a bridge built by Joseph Bailey, and with that, the campaign was over. Once the Federals dismantled the bridge they'd used to cross over the river, Taylor had no way to pursue Banks any farther.
Edward Canby had arrived at Simmsport on the 18th and was waiting to inform Nathaniel Banks of the reorganization ordered by Washington. Banks returned to New Orleans, where his responsibilities were primarily administrative. He did nothing that Canby didn't approve beforehand.
Later that year, Banks secured a leave of absence and he traveled to Washington, where he tried to salvage his military career. However, by that time, with the 1864 election over, Abraham Lincoln had no further use for Banks as a field general. The president did pick Banks to head up the Reconstruction government in Louisiana, but all that did was mark Banks as Lincoln's man, and so put him in the bad graces of the radical Republicans in Congress, who believed they ought to control Reconstruction policy, not the president.
In Washington, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War heard testimony on the Red River Expedition from December 1864 through April 1865. The radicals were out for blood, and Banks' incompetence as a field commander made him an easy target.
On the Confederate side, Dick Taylor was incensed after Kirby Smith returned from Arkansas and let it be known that he thought he, that is Smith, had vanquished Nathaniel Banks and David Dixon Porter and Frederick Steele. On June 5th, Taylor wrote a letter to Kirby Smith, making clear the mistakes he thought Smith had made during the campaign. Failures in Arkansas that allowed Steele to get back to Little Rock, and errors in judgment that left Taylor so weakened in Louisiana that he couldn't stop Banks from retreating to safety. Not wishing to serve under Kirby Smith any longer, Dick Taylor asked to be relieved of his command.
5 days later, Kirby Smith ordered that Taylor be put under arrest. Unfortunately for Smith, on that same day, June 10th, in Richmond, the Confederate Congress passed a joint resolution praising Dick Taylor for his actions during the recent campaign. Taylor was promoted to lieutenant general and given the Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana.
As for Shreveport, despite Nathaniel Banks' best efforts to reach it in the spring of 1864, Federal troops wouldn't enter the town until June 6, 1865, just short of 2 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South by Robert K.D. Colby.
An Unholy Traffic was published just this past year, and at some point we received a copy and put it in our to-be-read pile. Well, we got around to it recently, and wow, it's excellent, showing how from Fort Sumter to Appomattox, the internal slave trade within the South continued unabated and helped the Confederacy fight the Civil War. Anyway, we're glad we have a chance now to recommend Colby's book to you.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Mary T., Keith G., Alan L., and Gem Girl 2 have all done recently.
A big thank you to each of them, and also to Stephen M. and Bear F. and Erwin J. for their donations.
Also a big thank you to Spiritwood Music for allowing us to use their song, Midnight on the Water, as the music you hear at the beginning and at the end of every episode of the podcast. And, as we always do at this time of year, we'll let you know that Spiritwood has some lovely instrumental holiday music that you might want to check out.
And with that, we'll say thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.